Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having us. I want to say to you that you are very, very lucky, not because you're having me here. You're very lucky because you have Nick moderating this extraordinary conference. He is one of the most gifted, able diplomats that live today. And I'm not saying this to be nice to Nick because, first of all, I'm an Israeli. We don't know how to be nice. We live in a tough neighborhood. You'll be convinced of that in the next 30 minutes. And also because I have a perspective. And it's something with my biography that Nick doesn't know about, which is when I was a teenager, I spent hundreds of hours. I was basically a part of the household of the legendary diplomat of Israel's history and one of the most legendary diplomats in world history, Abba Eban. And so when I say what I say to you about Nick, trust me, I have the perspective. Secondly, you're very lucky because, in the past 2.5 decades, I've been involved with a number of Israelis and a large number of Arabs, unofficials, academics, former government officials, former generals, in informal conversations across the world in an attempt to move forward the prospects of peace in the Middle East. We usually refer to these as track 2, as opposed to track 1, official negotiations. One of the pioneers of this process is living among you here in Camden, Brewster Grace, who at that time was head of the Quakers office in Amman, was one of the pioneers of this process more than 2 decades ago. And I want to salute him for his efforts to get us and our Arab colleagues together. Yesterday and this morning, after I heard Robin's inspiring speech and also Mark Lynch's extraordinary speech on Egypt, Robin, as you recall, started with 5 episodes, reasons for optimism, and then went through these 10 trajectories. When she reached already the 7th, I was reaching for my Prozac. And I was thinking about, is, so how in the end can we be optimistic? And I was thinking, what does this remind me of? And I thought it would remind me of 2 things. Number one is that famous story about when Elizabeth Taylor got married for the 7th time. And somebody asked, what in the world did the 7th husband think? That where he would succeed where the first 6 failed. And this was labeled the triumph of hope over experience. And the second, and with this I will end my... the second is, of course, the famous story about the CNN group that walks around the streets of Tel Aviv looking for the average Israeli to interview when they finally find one. And they ask him to summarize the situation in 1 word. So the guy says, are you crazy? Look at what's going on here. Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and so on. So they said, yes, but we are CNN. We don't have time for more than 1 word. And so it goes back and forth. Finally, the Israeli surrenders and say, well, if it's 1 word, the situation is good. So they looked at him and said, and what if we gave you 2 words? He says, 2 words? He says, not good. Should I take the questions now? Okay. Well, unfortunately, my remarks today are going to be on a more ominous subject, so I beg your forgiveness of that on that count. We have in Israel a famous negotiator who's now a member of our Supreme Court, Eliakim Rubinstein. I think probably Nick knows him. Eliakim was very known to whenever he had to give a speech, he said, before I start speaking, let me say a few words. So I have about 5 preambles to what I'm going to tell you. The first is the subject that I was asked to talk about, which is Israel versus Iran, is the most difficult subject that I've had to grapple in 35 years of my professional life. If not truly existential, it involves fateful issues, very, very complicated issues that have no easy recipes. All options that are being discussed have serious, serious downsides. So my first point to you is beware of, and be very, very suspicious of anyone who offers simple prescriptions to this issue. It seems simple to people who are outside government, whether it's in Israel or the US, especially people who live in different neighborhoods, whether it's Camden or what I refer to sometimes as the sovereign state of Cambridge, Massachusetts. But unfortunately, people who live in that neighborhood don't have the same luxury. Second point is I'm not an Israeli ambassador. I never was. And my role here is simply to share with you my understanding of what is the thinking on this in Israel. And the most important thing is to understand that there is no such thing as an Israeli narrative about Iran or an Israeli understanding of Iran. There is no single Israeli position. And if you gain anything from this discussion, it should be that next time that you hear somebody, one of the talking heads on CNN or some other media, tell you this is Israel's position, and it is so-and-so or this and that, you will know that this is not the case, because there is no such thing as an Israeli position on this issue. This is an issue of a heated debate in Israel. And this is tied to my third point, which is this debate is not a partisan debate. It is, first of all, the most extensive debate that we've had in Israel since the other very, very emotional debate. The most emotional debate in my memory had nothing to do with our immediate neighbors. It had to do with whether to establish relations with Germany after the war. And the debate raged in the 1950s and 60s when the memory of the Holocaust was even sharper than today. And as I said, this is not a debate that's a partisan debate. For this reason, it was not a subject of the recent elections in Israel. Not because it was not important, it was very important, but simply because the debate on this issue crosses party lines. And in fact, and the other problem is we don't have a pro-Ahmadinejad party running in the parliamentary elections in Israel. So, and oftentimes this was mostly a debate between members of Israel's defense community and some of the political leaders. And those members of the Israeli defense community, on the whole, tended to be more flexible than their political superiors. The fifth and final preamble is to give you a sense of what this debate is not about. First of all, there is no debate around the issue, the proposition that Iran going nuclear is a bad idea. That it may lead to the kind of cascade that was described here, or at least referred to Saudi Arabia, Turkey, with implications to parties like Hezbollah and Hamas, and I'll get back to that. So it's not just a matter of the mullahs dropping a bomb on Tel Aviv. There are other reasons to be worried about this. So this is not, there's a lot of questions which I'll get to, but that's not a question being debated. Secondly, the debate is not about whether a military option against Iran's nuclear installations should be on the table. Almost everyone agrees that somehow it should remain on the table, that somehow the lesser means of preventing or dissuading Iran from going nuclear have to be backed up by a credible military threat. And the third thing that's not debated is whether a military action against Iran's nuclear installations will, quote unquote, solve the problem. Even people who are proponents of a military strike don't believe that this is going to gain more than a few years of delay, but they also have some experience. When Israel took the decision to bomb the Iraqi reactor in 1981, the assumption also was that Israel would not gain more than 3 or 4 years. But one thing leads to another in the Middle East, and somehow the prospects of Saddam Hussein with nuclear weapons was averted. So giving you a sense now of what the debate is not about, let me just give you a sense of what the debate is about. The first, and I would say the first question, which I call the mother of all debates regarding the prospects of Iranian nuclear weapons, is this an existential threat? Would they, if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, would they actually contemplate dropping a bomb on Israel to expedite the fulfillment of Ahmadinejad's prediction, quote unquote, about Israel's early demise? Can a nuclear Iran be deterred? Would it behave as a rational actor? And there are two schools here. One school believes that this is an existential threat, that the national physical survival of Israel and the Israeli population is at stake. And the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu believes that Ahmadinejad is a Hitler, committed to destroying Israel, that a nuclear Iran would bring us back to the 1930s, with the rise to power of Nazi Germany, superimposed with nuclear weapons. And that therefore nuclear weapons in the hands of Muslim fanatics like Ahmadinejad is like Hitler equipped with nuclear weapons and posing a truly existential threat. So at bottom, this postulates a proposition that fanatics cannot be deterred, that therefore any notion that a nuclear Iran can be deterred in the same way that the Soviet Union was deterred over 6 decades of the Cold War is based on a dangerously irrelevant analogy. The second school believes that a nuclear Iran is a very serious threat, but not an existential threat. It believes the first school exaggerates the magnitude of an Iranian nuclear threat. This school believes that Israel is very powerful. In the words of Defense Minister Barak, quote, Israel is very strong and has a response to every contingency. This school believes that Israel's nuclear option will deter Iran, and that while Ahmadinejad talks the talk, Iran as a nation is not suicidal and will not risk its own annihilation just to destroy Israel. Particularly that Israel's destruction would be associated with the destruction of Jerusalem, the second most holy center for Muslims. So this school rejects the comparison to the 1930s as irrelevant, if not insulting, given that in the 1930s, Jews did not have a state of their own, let alone a state that's perceived by all of its neighbors as being nuclear armed. So to sum up, the opponents of a strike argue that Iran's leadership is not mad, and that there is no evidence that it is insensitive to the kind of costs that are associated with nuclear retaliation. And that therefore, while Israel will probably not be able to deter and contain all the regional implications of a nuclear Iran, it will be able to deter Iran from using nuclear weapons against Israel. This is the fundamental issue at debate. Now there are 3 questions that are being debated about the program itself, about Iran's nuclear program. The first question is, how close are they to a capability that can easily be translated or converted to weapons? In other words, is there time? And here the proponents of a strike argue that the time is ticking quickly, that the magnitude of Iran's enrichment program to 5% and now to 20% is moving very fast. And the movement of Iran's, more and more of Iran's enrichment capabilities to facilities that will be immune to any military strike, like the facility in Qom, dug deep into the mountains, close to a religious center, or the religious center of Iran, is creating a situation where it is going to be very soon that a military option would be irrelevant. And however, the opponents of the strike basically say that the estimates of Iran's nuclear program have consistently underestimated the problems that they have faced, and as well as the efficacy of the measures that have been taken so far to halt Iran's nuclear program, whether they be cyber or assassination of key scientists, and so on and so forth. So there is a huge debate even on this question of what's the timetable? What's the expiration date on a possible exercise of a military option? The second question, which Robin actually referred to in the discussion with Nick last night, is, will we know that a decision in Iran has been made to weaponize? And here there are two schools. Some people, both in the American and the Israeli defense communities, believe that we will know, that if the supreme leader makes the decision, we will know that he's made the decision to weaponize. Other people are very skeptical. They argue that once Iran has all the building blocks in place, everything will depend on this key question of intelligence. Will we actually know? Will we intercept the message that says the supreme leader has made the decision to weaponize? And here you've got a big technical issue, because all the other facets of this nuclear program require very large facilities, whether it's the enrichment facility in Natanz, whether it's the new facility in Qom, whether it's the heavy water reactor in Iraq, and so on and so forth. The conversion of nuclear material, fissile material, to weapons can be made in a very, very small facility, easy to conceal. So the question is, will you know, is a question that's heatedly debated. And that, of course, the combination of these questions, as I said, it boils down to then the final operational question, which is, so is there time for exercising other measures, including sanctions, which we know take a long time to have effect? There are three other questions that involve the issue of a military strike to prevent the worst-case analysis, a nuclear Iran from taking place. The first question is, what would be the regional consequences of a military strike? And here the opponents of a strike argue that this would ignite a regional war, that it would propel Iran's allies. Previously it was Syria. Syria is now embroiled in its own problems, Hamas, Hezbollah, and so on and so forth. Proponents of a strike argue that fears of the regional repercussions are overrated and unwarranted. Most Arab states will be happy to see Iran's nuclear program arrested, no matter what their public position and rhetoric will be. This has been demonstrated convincingly when the entire Arab world remained completely silent when Israel destroyed a nuclear reactor in Syria in 2007. And that was a strike against an Arab country. And so those who are skeptical of the notion that this is going to ignite a regional war argue, will the Arab world go to a regional war over a strike against a Persian facility in a situation where they remained completely silent when a nuclear reactor in an Arab country was destroyed? So the first question is, what would be the costs in the region of such a strike? The second question is, what do you need to do in other fronts to reduce the costs of a military strike? And there is a strong school in Israel that says, if you find yourself in a situation where you believe that Israel has no alternative but to strike Iran's nuclear facilities, then certainly you have to take some measures, significant measures that involve significant risk, to move the peace process with the Palestinians forward. So the region understands that this is not a bellicose policy, that Israel strikes only when it needs to, and it can make peace when it needs to. And the third issue, which was really the focus of the debate in the last year, was how important are the objections of the Obama administration to an Israeli military strike at this time. And opponents of the strike argue that US-Israeli defense cooperation have reached unprecedented levels, and they have, including between the two countries' intelligence communities, and that cooperation on many fronts between the Joint Chiefs and the IDF General Staff have reached unprecedented levels of intimacy, and that therefore it would be insane for Israel to jeopardize this relationship for the sake of buying time in Iran's nuclear efforts. Proponents of a military attack imply that there are some occasions, and some have said this in so many words, there are some occasions when a nation's survival is at stake, that the call for action needs to be taken, even at the risk of tension in Israel's relations with its closest allies. And I would argue that the fact that the military strike has not taken place over the last year and a half, is indicative of the fact that the first school prevailed. The first school that said, we are not going to take a risk, to take measures that risk US-Israeli strong cooperation. Where are we now? In about 6 to 9 months, the estimate is that Iran's nuclear project will reach another crescendo. Iran will have made further progress with its nuclear program, reducing the time that it takes to convert a nuclear capability to actual weapons. This situation where you have all the building blocks in place and all that's needed is a decision is going to be a situation where even the heads of Israel's defense and intelligence communities that, as I said, over the last year and a half have been the more flexible ones, the ones who argue that Israel should not risk its relations with the US for the sake of buying time, the same defense chiefs that have opposed a strike in the last year and a half are going to be increasingly nervous because everything would depend then on the ability to have the accurate intelligence about an Iranian decision. So Israel will feel increasingly threatened and more nervous. The second point is that because of this crescendo, and for other reasons, it's very likely that the Obama administration will make a last heroic effort to find a diplomatic solution to this issue. If Iran engages in negotiations, and that's still a big if somebody heard the last speech of the Supreme Leader, he's basically ruled out a serious engagement with the US. This would raise other issues, which will require close coordination between the United States and Israel. What levels of enrichment would we tolerate, we America and Israel tolerate in Iran, given the fact that it's accepted almost as a common wisdom that whatever deal is made, Iran is not going to make a deal on the basis of zero enrichment. So what level of enrichment is tolerable? Secondly, what verification and monitoring would have to be put in place to verify that, in fact, the other side is keeping its side of the bargain? How do we verify that the other side would not use negotiations as simply a way of buying time? So I would like to close by a number of concluding remarks. First, as I said in the beginning, this is the toughest issue I've had to deal with in my first 35 years of professional life. This is not for the faint-hearted. It is a very complicated issue. It involves at least some existential issues. So I would just say again, if you hear somebody saying, if we only do this, do that, the problem will go away, we have a solution to the problem, be skeptical. Secondly, at least for Israel, what is at stake here is critical. And here I want to just say one word about what makes Iran so unique as far as Israel is concerned. In May 15, 1948, when Israel was established, Arab states invaded Palestine in an effort to prevent Israel from coming about. The Arab world has come around to accepting Israel as maybe an unfortunate, but it is as a fact of life in the Middle East. And not only that, but the Arab League, representing the consensus of the Arab world in 2002, launched something called the Arab Peace Initiative, which basically said, if Israel meets the following conditions, we are willing not only to establish peace with Israel, but to accept Israel as an integral part of the region. Iran remains now the odd man out. It's the only country in the region that still aspires for Israel's destruction. So there is a material, qualitative difference between Iran and all of other Israel's neighbors. And this is not only that Iran is the odd man out in terms of the countries surrounding Israel, but it is supporting two movements that are the only non-state movements in the region, Hamas and Hezbollah, which still have Israel's destruction as their primary goal. Now, what will confuse you further is that I will be followed after the break, after the discussion, with my good friend Hussein Mousavian from Iran. And you will come out even more confused from his talk because he is a real Iranian patriot, a professional of the first rate, immensely professional and immensely reasonable. And you will wonder, how does that mesh with everything I told you about Iran? So what I would like to tell you is that I wish the problem we had is with our next speaker. He and I could negotiate our way out of this problem. And if we failed, we will call Brewster Grace to help us. And if even Brewster Grace will not be able to help us, we will call in the heavy artillery, which is Nick. But unfortunately, we're not dealing with Hussein Mousavian. We're dealing with individuals like Ahmadinejad and the Supreme Leader who speak of Israel as the Satan and as something that needs to be destroyed, if not predict its early demise. And here is my last point, which unfortunately is not a happy story, which is we have to remember that all of this in Israel is seen through the prism of people who experienced only 67 years ago, not hundreds of years ago, only 67 years ago, the worst genocide in Israel's history. And they don't have the luxury of taking the kind of rhetoric that we hear from Iranian leaders, not from Hussein Mousavian, seriously. And the idea that people who talk about Israel's destruction will one day possess nuclear weapons is terrifying. So if you think this is complicated, the answer is no, it's not complicated. It's very, very, very complicated. Thank you very much.
Well done, as usual. That was well done. And a unique perspective from the real world of what it's like to be an Israeli in a tough neighborhood. So it seems to me, Shai, that Israelis and Americans are in the same boat. Neither of us want to see Iran go nuclear. We're arguing about who's captain of that boat. Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama have had a famously bad relationship. The president's going to make his first visit to Israel as president in a couple of weeks' time. Is this going to be the makeup tour, the olive branch tour? Will they learn to work together? Can they unite to turn to face Iran together? And will Israel, second, agree to let the United States lead? And will Israel not get ahead of the United States as Obama tries negotiations? That's a lot for you to take on. But you and I have talked about this before, and I know you have a view on this.
Well, I think that it boils down to what I said before, which is of course, the crux of the complication of the moment. The crux of the complication of the moment is that Israel has two conflicting considerations to take into account. It is very, very, very worried about the prospect of Iran becoming a nuclear weapon state, and it holds Israel's relations with the US very, very dear. And because of that, it is very sensitive to America's priority. And I cannot conceive a situation in which Israel tries to upstage the Obama administration. If a heroic effort to try to resolve this diplomatically at least takes off, that it gives at least a minimum of evidence that the Iranians are seriously engaged in a serious give and take with the US, yes, I think there will be a parallel conversation between the Israeli government and the US government on these issues that I described earlier. But it's inconceivable to me that Israel is going to upstage the United States. Our relations with the US is just too important. Of course, as I said, if it appears, a year later, a year and a half later, that even if the Iranians are engaging, they're only engaging in a way as to buy time, then, as I said, the Israeli side is going to get very nervous, and we will have to revisit this. We've been essentially in this conversation, the US and Israel, an intense conversation throughout the last 2 years. In my estimate or memory, there has not been a single 6-week period in the last 2 years that the Israeli Minister of Defense and the US Secretary of Defense have not met. The US Secretary of Defense has not met any single Minister of Defense of any country, including NATO countries, with the same intensity that he's met the Israeli Minister of Defense over the last 2 years. And there was a reason for that, of course, because both of us are facing the same problem, but the US has faced 2 problems. One is Iran, and number 2 is how to prevent Israel from moving faster than the United States was willing to accept during this period. So that was the grounds for this intense and intimate conversation, and I see this continuing.
So just one more question before we go to the audience. So the President Obama's strategy, as I understand it, is identical to President Bush's strategy, the one that I worked on when I was in government. It's we want to negotiate, we prefer negotiations, we don't want to fight, and we think there's at least a possibility of some kind of a compromise deal out there with the Iranians. But we need to push the Iranians towards that deal through sanctions and the threat of force. Is that the right strategy?
Well, the problem you see is the problem with this approach until now has been in exactly what you said. This is a policy that began already with the Bush administration. And now we're more than 4 years later, and that policy has still not brought the outcome that we would have all liked to see. And so the nuclear program continues to evolve. As I said, the dangerous zone that we're entering is a zone where the Iranians have most of the important building blocks in place. That, as I said, is going to put the Israeli side in this equation increasingly nervous. And how this is going to play out in the next 6 to 8 months, I don't know. Yes, until now, Israel has supported the US approach to this. And Prime Minister Sharon, way back, said, this is not an Israeli issue. This is a regional issue. It's an international issue. This is not about Israel. And he said that for a good reason, because he wanted the international community to take the responsibility that's required here. And also wanted to prevent any situation in which anything that Israel does will prevent the international community or give the international community the sense that they don't have to be engaged because Israel is going to deal with this issue. So the inclination of Israel until now and remains to let the United States lead this. But how long, given the fact that it already started, with the Bush administration, and now we're 5 years later?
Right. And to set up Hussein's presentation, he'll follow you. I got to ask.
Brilliantly.
He will. I think President Obama is going to give negotiations a big, big shot. He's going to take a lot of time. He's going to be very patient. He wants negotiations. But if it fails, there's going to be a major debate in our country. Do we then use military force to at least delay the program, or do we try to contain Iran, not use military force, wait them out because we're stronger than they are? What would you advise in that situation?
This is exactly what I said. This is the crux of how and why this is so tough. Because let me give you an imaginary conversation. accept it for the purpose of discussion that it's an imaginary conversation. So instead of you sitting on my right, I will have Prime Minister Netanyahu sitting on my right. And I will argue that if everything else fails, Israel can fall back on containing and deterring Iran. And I will make the argument that, yes, Iran is not the Soviet Union, but there is no evidence that Iran is insensitive to the kind of costs that are involved in nuclear retaliation. That, in fact, Iran's behavior, in contrast to its rhetoric, has shown a higher sensitivity to costs than, for example, Saddam Hussein's secular Iraq, that has embroiled his country in a deadly war with Iran, invaded Kuwait, and so on. If you separate Iran's behavior from rhetoric, you will find that Iran's behavior until now, has been very sensitive to costs. So all these are good reasons to believe that deterrence and containment will work.
Rational, pragmatic.
Right, and I will have this conversation, and it will last about 3 or 4 hours, and then the Prime Minister will turn at about 1:30 in the morning and say, and what if you're wrong?
And he'd be right to ask you that question.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for your candor. In the balcony, and then we'll take a remote question.
Was that my question? Okay.
Yes, and if you could identify yourself.
It's David. David Greenway.
David, thank you.
Picking up on two things.
David, I know you're going to ask me the most difficult question.
Picking up on two things that were said. Shai, when you said when a nation's survival is at stake, and Nick, you said the threat of force. Can you conceive of a situation where Israel, not getting the response it wants from the United States, would go back on its oft-said statement, we shall not be the first country in the Middle East to introduce nuclear weapons? In other words, is there a nuclear elephant in the room here that to prevent Iran getting a bomb that Israel might go nuclear?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I will say this, that even those, my assumption is that even those who say Israel does have an option of falling back on containment and deterrence, once Iran goes nuclear, I don't think that people who believe in the deterrence containment option would be willing to tolerate the remaining degree of ambiguity that exists in the region about Israel's own capabilities. In other words, since, and particularly because there would be this lingering question about what actually are the intentions of Iran's leadership, because of all the issues we discussed earlier. They would at least like to reduce the likelihood, I think, that there would be any doubts on the minds of Iran as to what Israel's capabilities are. So the inclination would be, in my view, in this kind of a situation, to sharpen Israel's deterrence, because if that's all you have to fall back on, then you cannot tolerate the kind of remaining even ambiguity. This complicates one of the questions that Nick or somebody asked Greg, because the issue of the possible cascade, everybody says, well, if Iran goes nuclear, wouldn't Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia have to follow suit? Well, what if, for example, Egypt will feel that it has to follow suit, not as a first reaction, as a first responder to Iran going nuclear, but because Israel will find itself in a situation where if Iran goes nuclear and neither Israel or the US have aborted that, and Israel faces now a nuclear adversary, will feel that it has to sharpen its own deterrent posture, then will the Egyptians be able to still say, oh, we can remain, outside of the game? What would be the Saudi position, and so on? The regional That is where, when President Obama talked about the fear of a proliferation cascade, he wasn't thinking just about the immediate reaction to Iran, but what kind of other processes in the region this would accelerate or launch that would complicate the strategic map of the region tremendously.
Thank you. We're going to go to, I think, Jim, a question from Fred Hall in Rockland. AIPAC's lobbying in Washington does not appear to reflect the diversity of views in Iran, but more a hardline view of Israel's current leaders. Does AIPAC, that's the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, have more clout in the United States than in Israel itself?
Well, first of all, AIPAC sees its primary responsibility as working in this country to help U.S.-Israeli relations, or you could say lobby for better relations between the United States and Israel. So first of all, AIPAC doesn't operate in Israel. As I said earlier, I'm not an ambassador of Israel here, and I'm certainly not an ambassador of AIPAC here. But I will say that one of the reasons why you see what is accurately reflected in the question is, and again, I'm stating this as an observation rather than trying to justify anything, but as an observation, because AIPAC sees its role as making sure that U.S.-Israeli relations are strong and doing what it can to create a large margin for Israel's security and defense, and in that framework, work for U.S.-Israeli defense cooperation. Basically, at least some of my colleagues or counterparts in AIPAC say, yes, this is our role to create these large margins. If you want to make concessions, you Israelis want to make concessions, fine, you can make the concessions. We'll create for you the room to make the concessions. Okay, it still leaves you the room to make those concessions. So that's at least the way that they see their responsibility, as best as I can understand it.
Thank you. We have a question right here. Yes, sir.
Davies Allen, Westport Island. I'm intrigued by your premise that if Israel was going to take on Iran militarily, that their first notion would be to settle with the Palestinians to offset the global notion that Israel was, aggressive and an aggressor. And if that's the case, why wouldn't Israel move forward in the peace process immediately so that they don't have to, catch up if all of a sudden the planes are warming up in Israel?
Well, you asked the wrong individual this question. Because I'm in favor of a completely different Israeli approach to the Palestinian issue than Israel's present government. Okay, if it were up to me, as I said, this is a very, very complicated issue. There are other issues, not Iran, but for example, what should be done about the Palestinians, for which I have a very simple answer. Okay. And on this one, my answer is that Israel has to take whatever measures are needed to create the conditions for a separation between Israel and the Palestinians, which implies the establishment of an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel. Let me tell you again. I already sort of surrendered some of my bio on this phase. I'm a fifth-generation Israeli, okay? And it's very easy for me to take a position. My family itself was not a victim of the Holocaust. My family was already in Palestine. My grandparents came to Palestine in 1858. And even from my father's side, I'm only third generation, they came from the Ukraine in 1922. So we were lucky not to be affected directly by the Holocaust. And some of the reasons why I take a more dovish position, if you wish, on the Palestinian issue is because I tend not to see everything through the prism of this very difficult historical experience, unprecedented historical experience called the Holocaust. For me, the very essence of Zionism, and I am an ardent Zionist, is the creation of a Jewish democratic state. And in my view, the continued control over a few millions of Palestinians against their will is a contradiction of the Israeli Zionist original commitment to having a Jewish democratic state. So, and Nick warned me in the break that he was going to ask me something about Israeli policy and the Arab Spring and so on and so forth. So, let me respond to the question he didn't ask. It puts this in perspective. If you actually look at the present government, which is actually the holdover because we don't have a new government yet resulting from the recent elections, and you look at the kind of regional reconfiguration and difficulties that we've talked about until now in Egypt, in Gaza, in Syria, in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. Actually, without having voted for Netanyahu, I've never voted for Likud. I would say that given the magnitude of these developments in Egypt, Syria, etc., I would say that on the whole, the Israeli government has actually handled itself very, very well, especially regarding the two critical issues of Egypt and Syria. Until now, it has not made a single mistake. And I would say that on the whole, even this cautious approach to the issue of Iran and how the government maneuvered itself, managed itself in this very heated, fateful debate, I give the Israeli government very high marks for until now playing it very, very well. The only part of Israel's policy, which I think is nothing short of insane, is the fact that the Israeli government is allowing this completely stalemated, deadlocked peace process to remain stalemated and deadlocked. That is where I take strong issue with the Israeli government because, as I said, I believe that unlocking this deadlock and engaging in serious negotiations that would produce a Palestinian state alongside Israel is an imperative for somebody who really believes in Zionism as ardently as I do.
With your indulgence, we're going to have a break until 3:45. I'd like to go a couple of more minutes because we have a couple more people who want to ask questions. But Shai, just to clarify this last point, it's an important point. What I hear you saying is that, and I'll just interpret a little bit, Israel has a permanently destabilized border with Lebanon, likely to have an incredibly difficult relationship with Syria, likely to have an unstable, erratic Egypt on its border. It thus makes sense to make peace with the one neighbor which is not unsettled and destabilized right now, the Palestinian community in the West Bank, at least in the West Bank.
Right.
That's what you're saying?
Well, yes, but here again, the problem is this, is that, so here's the difference, and it's not, I mean, of course there is an ideological dimension to this. The Israeli right gives more weight to the Israeli historical or the Jewish historical, even biblical attachment to the land than I do.
Of Judea and Samaria.
Yes, of Judea and Samaria, or referred to as the West Bank. I see more the imperative of making sure that Israel remain a Jewish and democratic state. So there is that difference. But there's also another difference, which is that leaders, in my view, are, I would say, roughly divided into two types. One is, and unfortunately, I think this is what we suffer, especially when you deal with the question of, so is this the time to initiate on the Palestinian front? So some leaders, when they see the neighborhood in such turmoil as we see the neighborhood in Israel, around Israel right now, some leaders' tendency is to hunker down, to say, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, so how can we even calculate the risks that are involved? And that is not a subject of debate. The fact that an agreement with the Palestinians would involve a measure of risk is not in dispute. Of course, there is a dispute about how risky and so on and so forth, but it's clear that it involves a measure of risk. So Netanyahu, I think, is taking the position that we don't know where this is going. And believe me, to some extent, I was sitting here on this front row with my wife, Valerie, and I was thinking, boy, if Bibi was sitting here and he was hearing Robin's 10 points, I mean, he would
never
say,
want to make peace.
he would just say, fasten your seatbelt, my gosh, and so on and so forth. Now, this is a philosophical difference, you see, because my approach, maybe I'll borrow a line from Greg, I must probably am a minority, no, I'm not. But my approach is basically the approach of an entrepreneur in a really, really, really bad economy. A good entrepreneur in a really bad economy will always find opportunities. And so my view about this is that you need to think of this entrepreneurially. But again, I say, right now I am, although I have continue to have a household in Tel Aviv, I have a household in the sovereign state of Cambridge, Massachusetts, as you know. And it's much easier to give these kinds of prescriptions in the beauty of Camden than when you're sitting in the Israeli Prime Minister's office and the security of 7 million people, only 67 years after the Holocaust, is on your shoulders. And I still remember a historical discussion when Sharon made the fateful decision to withdraw from Gaza. And the settlers who saw Sharon for decades as their father came to complain and said, how can you do this? I mean, this is against everything that you believed in. And so, of course, the substantive answer was, there are demographic trends in the region that if Israel doesn't begin disengaging for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, Israel as a Jewish and democratic state's future is in question. But then, of course, sitting behind this very large desk of the Israeli Prime Minister that I'm sure you've seen on more than one occasion, and them sitting on the other side of the table, Sharon famously said, what you see from there is not what you see from here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well said. Final quick question and answer, and then we'll take a break.
Hello, Jane Nurse from College of the Atlantic. Thank you very much for your presentation. And you've answered quite a few questions I had for you already, so that's great, so I can narrow it down to one question. And my question for you is, you said that you highlighted how Israel in itself has multiple voices, that there's a heated debate going on. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in breaking apart those monolithic ideas we have. And so one thing I would like to hear you maybe talk a little bit more about is Israel's perception of itself is that it's a victim in the area and it's under legitimate threat. And what I hear from the Iranian side is that they feel very vulnerable and they also have issues with, they perceive Israel as their threat, basically. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm wondering is, do you see any movement or do you see a progress within Israeli society to kind of overcome, and I don't want to say that in a bad term, but overcome a certain victim complex, to not be paralyzed by the fear of what happened in history, but actually be able to understand, or move beyond that sense of paranoia paralysis, and what kind of measures could help to get there?
Thank you.
That's a very good question. So there are two parts to the answer to this. There are many people in Israel that are not totally, let's say, imprisoned by this prism, okay? If everybody in Israel was imprisoned by this prism, we would not have had a debate, okay? So, and it's not a surprise that some of the people that are taking, I would say, at least until now, have taken a slightly more relaxed view of this issue, a more balanced issue. As I said, I worry about whether they will be able to continue to have this relaxed issue 6 to 9 months from now, but have taken. It's not accidental that these people come from Israel's defense community, because they have a sense of Israel's strength, and so on and so forth. That's the first answer. The second answer is, I ask myself, how did we, in previous cases, overcome these kinds of prisons? And we have overcome some of these in our relationship, Israel's relationship, with its more proximate regional neighbors. We were able to do this because over 2 decades, as I mentioned, we've been engaged in informal conversations. And they started with many countries in the region before we even had, and with some countries, we still don't have the problem resolved, no peace treaty, but we had conversations which allowed each side to discuss its worries, its what we call in our boring professional language, threat perceptions, right? Share your threat perceptions, understand the other side's threat perceptions, understand another thing we talk about in our profession, mirror imaging, how everybody, reflects almost the same, and so on and so forth. The problem we have in the case of Iran is that unfortunately, because of a leadership view on the Iranian side of Israel as a Satan, the conversations have been much more limited than with some of our other neighbors. And some Iranians who have engaged with their Israeli counterparts in various parts of this world have come to Tehran and have had to answer to the Iranian security apparatus. And they will not willingly repeat that experience again. So this is a problem. As I said, I'm a lucky person because I got to know very well some of them, including our next speaker, which is the reason why I say that, if we didn't have this problem of the leadership, the political leadership, and its ideological commitment, and until now we have an ideological commitment to Israel's destruction, if we could work this out with Brewster's help, with Nick's help, between Israelis and their Iranian counterparts, we would be able to find a solution to this problem. But unfortunately, until now, the political conditions have not allowed this to happen.
We're going to take a break till 3:45. Join me in thanking Shai Feldman. Really.